Hi, and welcome to the Audrain Museum Network and this latest episode in Season 4 of Audrain Mansions Motorcars. We're glad that you love this series because we love making it for you. And if you like the channel, subscribe. Do it right now. Hit that button and the bell icon to be notified when we post new content. We'd love to see you here, and we can't wait to show you more. So today we're going to visit a really interesting house that's got a connection with a great family dynasty, and of course another famous family dynasty is Porsche. And so we're starting out in this 1987 Porsche Carrera.
Hence our tenuous connection.
Jay, I've got a treat for you. I've got two tenuous connections today.
Well, this car is interesting. This is probably the least exciting iteration of the Carrera name. It started with the Carrera 2 from the late 50s and early 60s. We'll get to that one. But this is a great car. It's funny. This car comes from the era. Right now, this is almost a 40-year-old car.
Exactly.
And in the real world that I grew up in, back in the day, you would buy this for maybe, if it was $20,000 new, it'd probably be $4,500 now because it's 40 years old. Porsche, of course, the name has become iconic. Anything with Porsche on it. Porsches are expensive, but not rare. I mean, there's certainly a lot of them around. And just the fact that there is a cult following, it shows you the respect and the love people have for these automobiles.
There's a real emotional connection that people have with Porsches.
And I must admit, this one is wonderful to drive. This is two-wheel drive, 3.2 liter. Normally it would have been about 218 horse, like most Porsches. This has been breathed on and has got probably another 75 or 100 horsepower
Producing
more.
quite a bit more,
Yeah.
and that's one of the great things too. One of the things that attracts people to Porsches like this is their tunability. You can still maintain great road drivability, great street use every day, but gives them a little bit more punch.
Well, I probably said this before, but whenever you read Road and Track or Car and Driver, and they do road tests where they get 5 sports cars, which is the best, all that kind of stuff. The cars with the most mileage on them are always Corvette and Porsche. Porsche and Corvette people brag. I bought a 90,000 mile Corvette for a buddy of mine I went to high school with as a present, and it was $12,000, and he loves it. It's like a brand new car. I mean, it runs. He's had it for 2 years, not a problem. That motor, you can just rack up mileage all day long with it. Same thing with Porsche. Now that might be heresy to compare Porsche to Corvette, but I'm just saying what the reality is. In the real world, these are cars that people drive.
I think that your comparison is actually quite apt. Again, we're talking about the emotion, and I think you would agree with me that the emotional connection that Corvette owners have with their car is probably second only to that of Porsche people, and it's a very experiential kind of connection.
Right.
You buy a Porsche like this, you buy a Corvette to drive it, to take road trips in, to go out for the weekend, Corvette owners get together and bring their cars down to the Bowling Green to visit the factory.
Right.
That kind of thing. And, certainly the fact that we talk about club life a lot, the Porsche Club of America is extremely active, has lots of events for people, driving events, track events, so people really get to use and enjoy their cars.
Right.
And of course, it's really interesting because there are very few manufacturers Toyota boasts that the best-selling nameplate of all time is the Toyota Corolla,
Right.
because they built so many millions of them across very, very different cars with the same name.
Right.
But Porsche built the basic car, the 911, for a very long time, and this series, the 911, is the last of the development of the original, the car that started as the 901 in 1964. So that also says a lot for the way this chassis and platform was developed. People that drive this car today, I think, would find this extremely different from an early short wheelbase 911.
Right. Plus, they're also a victim of their own success. Much like Corvette. When Corvette came out with a C8 and it didn't have round taillights, heresy! It's not a Corvette. I will never buy one of those, because you're always looking for that younger market,
Yeah.
and consequently, it was just whenever. Let's face it, the mid-engine Corvette, the Boxer, with the big motor, I think probably handles better than the 911. But if it takes a certain talent to make a 911 handle, and that's part of if you can do it, you're in a very exclusive club,
I think you really hit the nail on the head there. Really hit the nail on the head there, because for me, the biggest difference between this 1987 911 Carrera and an early short wheelbase 911 is the fact that this is a car that is very easy to drive.
Right.
It's easy to drive quickly. An early 911, as you said, was a contest to see if you could master the car and its very particular handling characteristics. I mean, obviously you as a Corvair owner are very familiar with the handling characteristics of high-performance rear-engine cars.
Right.
And so it's one of those things that what makes something a challenge for a driver is not necessarily that which makes for a great commercial success.
Yeah. But I have to admit, it's only been 5 minutes, but I have a real connection with this car already. There's just a mechanicalness to Porsche. Of the 3 cars that we're driving today, I thought, not that any Porsche is boring, but this one is the least interesting to me because I own a Carrera too, and I own the modern Carrera. I'm curious to drive someone else's and see what they're like, But driving this, I'm very impressed. It just feels, this car is 40 years old.
Exactly.
Just about 40 years old. And incredibly tight. And there's a wonderful, being cliche, Swiss watch feeling to the shifting,
Yeah.
I don't know whether this has an aftermarket shifter kit or some upgrade, but it just shifts so nicely. I'm shifting just for the sheer fun of shifting the car,
Yeah, it's a really funny thing. I often thought for a very long time that I didn't understand why so many Porsche owners and drivers would keep their car in second and third gear so often.
Yeah.
But it is for the joy of the shifting and for feeling the engine in the power band. It really is quite a pleasure. And that Porsche brand character really comes through in the way this car drives.
And whatever else you've driven, this is so unlike it, except maybe perhaps Volkswagen. But the flat Boxer engine, the way they're put together, climb at the Shell station can't work on your Porsche. You have to get a guy who knows these motors.
Court at the Mobile.
Right.
It is something that it still retains that individual character without being something that's difficult to drive. It's just different. And it's a great lead-in to talking about the house that we're going to see today.
Right.
Which is a really interesting place that has sort of 3 histories. As I mentioned before, one connected with the great family dynasty, but not necessarily the original owner of the house, but a house with a great deal of character and personality that comes from a dynastic connection.
Right. It's so funny. I'm old enough to remember when people would come up with practical reasons to buy a Porsche. You know, now you're buying it because it's a Porsche, it's got the reputation, you know, all of that. But I can remember people saying, you know, well, you know, it's air cooled, so you never have to put coolant in it, and you can't crack the block in wintertime. And oh, that was a big selling point.
Absolutely.
That was requires very little maintenance. You know, you don't really. It'll never overheat on you. You know, and you go, oh, okay. And I remember people using that as selling
a rationale, exactly.
Why you should buy one, other than just, well, it's a Porsche. I mean, you know.
You drive because you want to have fun going to work and going on a ski vacation and all those other things.
And the other part is that people actually learn to say the name correctly, as opposed to Porsche. Like you sit out on your front porch, you know, and I drive my Porsche, you know. It's Porsche.
To think about a car having this kind of performance that you can also take to the grocery store.
Right.
And a vintage car, and we talk a lot about sort of young timer classics, 1980s car that has a very distinctive, characteristic feel of a vintage car and yet totally modern usability.
Well, the funny thing is, it has a very nationalistic feel as well. Mm-hmm. You know, again, I hate to keep talking about how old I am, but I remember when cars had a national flavor to them. British cars were very British in the way they did things and the way they didn't do some things. American cars you could identify from, you know, 100 paces. German cars had a certain feel. Now everybody builds a world car, part of it is assembled in Mexico, then it's shipped to Italy, then it's shipped. But back in the day, there was such a thing as German precision and German accuracy, which
Exactly.
you didn't get in other cars, you know.
And it's the feeling of sort of heft that every German car had, whether it was a VW Beetle or a Mercedes-Benz.
Right. I remember there was an old joke. Someone said they went to England because the policemen were polite, and you remember that thing?
Yeah.
And the chef is Italian. Then the
definition of hell.
Yeah, definition. Right. The chef is German. No, the police are
German. The chef is oh no, it wasn't French. I can't remember what it was. Chef is English. Chef is English. Exactly. Yeah.
And it's just the whole thing, you know. But and this probably is the last era that kind of defines that.
Yeah.
This car is really tight as a drum skin. It's amazing that this car is almost 40 years old. And I don't think it's been rebuilt.
No.
I just think it's been maintained. And
maintained and gently upgraded respectfully.
Oh yeah, this thing is, it's very nice to drive. You know, it's funny, and Porsche has somehow managed to avoid a fate that has hit other cars, in the sense that when something terrible happens, it's the car's fault. And that car, the Corvair would be a good example.
Right.
The Ford Pinto, well, in Pinto's case, it was the manufacturer's fault. But what I mean is, I guess what I'm referring to is James Dean had a horrible accident. We thought, oh, it made the car legendary. Paul Walker, and although he was not driving, he was a passenger. That accident has, you know, sort of increased the legend of the Carrera 2, that only certain people, you have to be careful if you can handle one of those. It reminds me of the cigarette manufacturers back in the day. You know, back in the 50s and 60s, they used subliminal advertising and it had the word cancer come up. So people would feel as if, ooh, they're beating cancer by smoking. You know what I'm saying? That sort of thing. But it is funny how Porsche is not a car anyone blames for the fault. It's always the fault of the driver.
It's interesting. You're absolutely correct. But it also, I think, speaks to the whole idea of mastery. That this is a car that you have to pay attention to, you have to be on top of. And so if you can be someone who can master the car, then you've really accomplished something. Suppose someone's just sort of cruising around, oh, anybody can drive one of those cars.
Right, exactly.
And that indeed adds to the mystique in a way that you're right, that it wouldn't for a Corvair. I mean, mastering the art of driving a Corvair at speed, I think, is also a great thing.
Yeah. It is almost impossible to define Porsche-ness, you know. But this car has it. You know, I thought this would be the most boring of the three cars to drive, but it's really terrific. I just like the way it feels. It just makes a connection.
I think I can define, certainly for myself, not for the world, Porsche-ness, which is a liveliness, a connection, and a feeling of solidity and strength without a lot of heft. Which is one of the reasons why I really like the older Porsches so much. So I think that, you know, we're going to see that in the house that we're going to, Ocean Lawn, which is one of the amazing classic Newport estates on the ocean that just has such incredible character, a very unique character, much like a Porsche.
Now, was this built during the Gilded Age in the 1800s or 1900s?
It's an 1888 house.
Wow.
And it has all of the character you expect in Newport.
Let's go take a look.
Here we are at this wonderful house, Jay, and let's go see why this house is named Ocean Lawn.
Works
Come on.
for me.
It's very easy to see why this house was named Ocean Lawn. This amazing expanse of lawn looking out to the bay and to the ocean. Absolutely extraordinary.
It really is something. And I'm amazed that even in a setting like this, you can wear pajama bottoms and it looks stylish.
That is actually one of the tenuous connections
That's right, I
between
was gonna
what
say.
I'm wearing and this home.
That's right, but it does not detract from the home at all. It actually helps the home, I think.
I think it adds a great deal, in fact.
I mean, it's an amazing piece of property. Just you know, this is land you don't see in California. You don't get this. When you buy a house in Malibu, you get like a little patch of grass, you know. And here, I mean, it's amazing. It's almost as if you're buying it back in the day, although this originally was what, 22 or 40 acres or
This is
something?
originally over 30 acres of land.
Okay.
This house was built in 1888 for Mrs. William Gamble. As you may recall from one of the houses we did in the first season of Mansions and Motorcars, Hope Dean, this entire stretch of land here in Newport was all owned by the Gamble family.
Wow.
And each of them built houses on different parts of the land. And this house by Peabody and Stearns is this wonderful mixture of Queen Anne and Tudor, just perfect for the setting, which you might not think ideal at first, but Peabody and Stearns were quite expert at building their mansions here in Newport, their cottages here in Newport, to take advantage of the views. Even though it is in the Tudor and Queen Anne styles, it still has ample windows so that you actually get a sense
Right.
of where you are in the space.
Well, it's just an amazing piece of property.
The most famous residents of Ocean Lawn were Harvey Firestone Jr. and his wife Betsy.
Sure.
Harvey Firestone Jr. and his wife bought this place in 1950 because they decided they needed to have an East Coast seaside vacation home. And they really made this very much their own house. Of course, it was at the time when Firestone was making so much money they didn't know what to do with. The great success of his father and Henry Ford's partnership really helped the Firestone Tire Company
Right.
develop into something wild. We discussed the fact that we're talking about dynasties, family dynasties today, and the Porsche family and the Firestone family are two great dynasties
I
connected
remember
with
they
the...
used to, Henry Ford and Harvey Firestone used to go camping together, along
Exactly.
with Thomas Edison.
Correct.
Yeah, and Ansel Adams. In fact, Henry Ford told a famous story about Ford, Edison, Firestone, and Ansel Adams were camping, and Ansel had a big beard, and they stopped into some little general goods store, you know, some kind of Gabby Hayes looking guy where, "Hi you fellas, how you doing?" And Henry Ford, "Do you know who we are?" He goes, "No." "Well, I'm Henry Ford. That's Thomas Edison. That's Harvey Firestone." Before I got to and the old man said, "Who's the guy with the beard? Is that Santa Claus?" And Henry Ford thought that was the funniest thing, because he loved that common man, the common wisdom, you know. It was really quite. Well, you had to be there. Yeah.
Well, you know, I think it's still a good joke, and the fact that the great fortunes that were made in the automobile industry that reflected themselves in very grand houses, like Henry Ford's Fairlane, for instance.
Right.
You see that there's an expression, however, that these people were self-made. So therefore, when we look inside a house like Ocean Lawn, it's not one of these places like the Breakers or Marble House where we have these vast ballrooms. They're actually fairly, dare I say, intimate-sized spaces. They're rooms that people actually live in.
And the interesting thing was, even though it was 100 years ago, Henry Ford, they did it to get away from electricity and all these crazy modern convenience, to get back to nature.
Back to nature.
They wanted to get back to nature, and that they just bought, a little cooking stove, and they shot their own food and skinned rabbits, and that's what they did. Even though they were the wealthiest men in the world.
And then they came back to their mansions.
Exactly.
But another thing which is very interesting about this place today, Mrs. Firestone lived in this house until she passed away in 1990. And she was someone known for her fashion. She was known as one of the best dressed women in America. She had an extensive wardrobe, and in fact, had a house adjacent to this one on the property that just served as her closet.
Wow, there you go. Now,
and so
don't tell my wife. Hey,
anything's possible, Jay. But today in this house, under the caretakers of this house today, the wonderful racing driver Alexis DeJoria,
right,
and she and her father and her mother have done a wonderful job of restoring and decorating this house to an amazing degree. They've really done a very good job of restoring it to a level of splendor, yet of history. In the den, we see Harvey Firestone Jr.'s actual partner's desk. Right. So you have that connection with this house, which I think is really important here in Newport, to keep that living history together.
Well, let's take a look.
All right. One of the distinguishing features of Ocean Lawn are the details. Quite typical of townhouses, they include remarkable millwork, starting with the clever recesses for the front doors when they are fully open, continuing and completing the panelwork of the entryway. And as an oceanfront home, Peabody & Stearns gave it a dramatic full-view entry from the driveway to the water, from the open double front doors through to the terrace. The collections of vintage armor and arms of Alexis DeJoria are perfectly housed in this setting, which complements their detail and workmanship. Each of the main rooms is notable for their bright, airy openness, where fine wood paneling and Adam-style mantelpieces combine with bold raised panel wall coverings to create an interesting mix of design elements which are alternatingly light, elegantly formal, and more powerful and substantial in nature. Speaking of nature, the vast lawn is not the only notable outdoor feature of Ocean Lawn. Formal gardens and a newly constructed guest house, pool, and workshop complex give added interest to the property, and their style perfectly complements the original home and seem to have been planned by Peabody & Stearns at the same time. Ocean Lawn speaks to the domestic scale of architects in the years just before the more expected Newport cottage style would be the driving force in the city. So in continuing our Carrera journey,
right,
we're going to try a second Carrera, which perhaps is more true to the actual Carrera name and its roots. Let's go.
Oh, this is a great one. Well, this thing is great. This is a 64, mine is a 63. But this, 64, 65 are basically the same. And this is the last and best version of the Carrera. And this is the one to have sunroof coupe and the twin cam engine, amazing build quality, wonderful car to drive. Mine has the racing seats, which are actually pretty comfortable, but these look very comfortable too. So I'm anxious to go for a ride in this thing and see how different it is from mine. But I'm sure it's exactly the same because these are like Swiss watches, Engines are meticulously put together and expensive to maintain, but well worth it.
Expensive when new, expensive now.
Yeah.
But worth every penny.
Exactly.
This is the ultimate, as you said, expression of the Porsche 356.
Let's give it a shot.
Give it a try.
Well, as an example of how unfair life can be, Donald has chosen to drive the Carrera 2 instead of myself. I have one of these in 1963, just an amazing automobile. You see why it earned the Carrera name, and just a wonderful car. 4-cam, about
I guess around 150 horsepower, something like that. A car, you can take that tack to $7,000, keep it there all day long, and just keep driving. It is truly a wonderful, wonderful car.
Let's talk a little bit about the Carrera name, Jay,
right.
because obviously the cars we're driving today are Carreras, but why should people care about the name Carrera? What does it mean?
Well, it has to do with the Mexican road race of the 1950s. What was it, 1,000 miles, I think?
Slightly more than 1,000 miles from the south of Mexico all the way up to the U.S. border.
And unpaved roads and just crazy. I mean, it's still a crazy race, but it was even crazier then. And this is where Porsche earned the name. I remember, was it the Mercedes Gullwing where the birds smashed into the windshield?
John Fitch. John Fitch was driving. He's driving the W194 Mercedes, and a giant bird comes through and smashes the windshield. And you see photographs of the car later in the race with these vertical bars as if they're in a prison cell, just to protect them.
As if more birds are going to attack later on. They never did, but yeah. But anyway, back to this thing. Probably the most complex engine Porsche has ever built. The early models had the Hearth
roller bearing
crankshaft, and incredibly fast, incredibly powerful. But trouble is, you had to keep that thing spinning all the time. If you were idling in the light, the bearings would pound on each other, and you'd get only, I don't know, a few thousand miles on them, and do it again.
Which, again, is not really surprising because it's an engine built for competition.
Right.
And race car engines were rebuilt after every event.
But Bernard, my shop foreman, his dad was one of those guys, and when he had to do one, he would tell Bernard, leave me alone for the next 40 hours. And they would literally use tweezers to put in each ball bearing, and you had exactly this many in. They had to fit this tightly. I mean, it was just unbelievable. It was just unbelievable. But you got a tremendous amount of power of it. Then they went to the Furman crankshaft later on, which was a plain bearing, which was much better. That's what mine has. And you could drive it like a regular car.
And that's one of the things that is also sort of, legends arise and great tales and stories that, for years people thought that the 4-cam cars were absolutely undrivable and impossible to maintain. So people kept the cars, of course, because they're great cars, but took the engines out and put regular 356 engines in them. And then, of course, it was discovered there were a few great geniuses of the 4-cams. Jerry McCarthy, who was the other guy?
John Wilhoit.
John Wilhoit.
Yeah.
And they really convinced people that, no, with the proper building and maintenance, the engines were very, very usable indeed.
Right. In fact, my car, my 356 twin cam, I got a call one day from a young man. He said his father died. He had a Porsche for sale. And I said, which one? He said a 356. And I thought, well, that's okay. I don't need a 356. And he said, but it's one of the Carreras. It's a twin cam. And I went, oh, okay. So I went out to look at it. I looked at the car. I was impressed by it. And I thought, well, let me find the nearest twin cam guy to where this car is.
Right.
So I called a couple of Porsche guys I know, and they said, oh, this guy, John Wilhoit. Okay. Wilhoit lived about 10 miles away. So I called him. He said, what car is it? And I told him, I gave him the license number, and he said, hey, that's my car. I built that car. He said, I built that car in '76, and at the time, a guy offered me $16,000 for it, which is twice what it was worth. So he said, I had to sell it because I was buying a house or something. When I got it, like 25 years later, it only had 10,000 more miles on it. So Hoyt came to look at it, Wilhoit came to look at it, and it was exactly as he had sold it. So I bought it on the spot and still have it to this day.
Yeah, you don't miss an opportunity like that.
No. The only change I made, I put Weber carburetors on it.
Really? You find the Webers that had Solexes originally, correct?
Yeah, the Solex is okay, but the Webers work much better.
It's an amazing thing. I've said this to you before, Jay, and I said it to other Porsche friends of mine. For years, I never understood why people built outlaw 356s.
Right.
And then I drove my first Carrera 2, and I said, this is why they do it.
Yeah.
How incredibly capable this chassis is. And the fact that it took this long, until the late 1950s, for Porsche to really give this chassis the power it deserves. And it's also not surprising that so many people, real 356 devotees, were very disappointed when the 911 came out in 1964. They thought, nothing could beat this car.
Right.
And this is one of the last of the Carrera 2s built. It's a 1964 model.
It's sort of the end of an era in the sense of hand-built automobiles.
Yeah.
I mean, this was probably the most precision-built Porsche ever. I love the big wooden steering wheel, makes turning easier. There's no car I enjoy more watching the tach sweep across the dial than on this car. Because this is one I always use when I reference that. It's, you know, modern cars are so fast, ring, 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 and now you're going 120 and you're in jail and you have no idea why you got arrested, you know?
Exactly.
Whereas this thing, you put your foot in it and you see the tach go 4, 5, 6, 7, 72, and you shift. I mean, I just enjoy watching the gauges move on this thing while I'm driving it. Just a wonderful, wonderful car. Mine has the sport seats. These are the comfort seats, and they're actually quite comfortable. This one also has a really rare but scary option, the gasoline heater.
Well, you know, it also speaks to two things. One, the fact that these cars are meant to be driven. They're meant to be everyday cars.
Right.
And of course, if you live in the Northeast or in the upper Midwest, an air-cooled car's heat in the wintertime can be marginal.
Right, right.
So
no, that can be. It's marginal.
Well, I remember driving my 63 Corvair in the winter at college in Connecticut, and you know, you sort of got used to dressing warm for drives in the car.
You know, it is funny how, as Americans, we handle that. I mean, there are no better heating, cooling, air conditioning, whatever you want to call it, than American cars. I mean, you get in a European car, not so much nowadays, but in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and it would be marginal air conditioning at best. You know, I always tell the story of that McLaren F1. It came with air conditioning, but the guy said, if you want the good air conditioning, it's another $25,000. And I go, why doesn't it just come with good air conditioning? It didn't make any sense to me.
Well, again, it's a matter of the priorities. Simply priorities.
But this is the epitome of the Carrera. You had the sunroof coupe, very rare. Mine is the sunroof coupe as well. And it was an electric sunroof. It seemed unbelievable back in the day. Because even BMW had to turn the crank,
yeah.
You know, which was fine. I mean, you could have it. How lazy are you going to be? But just the sheer build quality of this thing. No rattles, no bangs.
And the amazing thing, too, about this particular car and these cars in general is the fact that they are very much vintage cars. I mean, this basic design dates back to 1948.
Right.
And yet, it's so incredibly usable on the street. I just did something you never, ever want to do with a 4-cam engine, is let it lug to 1,500 RPM. So I will be forgiven that fault.
Well, that's really something that dates back to the Hearth crankshaft. You had those roller bearings, you had it lug, the crank is pounding on the bearing, and you're getting the bearing, if not out of round, you're certainly flat spotting it, you know. So the idea is to always keep the revs up. But with the plain bearing, it's not such a crime.
And also it's interesting because the engine also has a good deal of torque down there, which you don't really expect. Although I am very grateful that we recently had a lot of good repaving projects around here.
Right.
Which makes our job a lot easier to handle. And as you said, Jay, it's just so rewarding to use the strength of this car and the gears. It's just,
I know.
And you know, you get that feeling. Obviously, you know, it's named for the Carrera. The 4-cam engine was built by Porsche for racing, and you feel like you're involved in it like a race car driver. Just the sheer mechanical sound of the car, the way it responds, it's just one of those grin-inducing drives.
Yeah, it's a wonderful car to drive. And this was easily twice as much money as the regular 1600. And And those are probably $4,500. These are about $7,800, something like that.
Yeah, they're really expensive.
And they were
to
the same
begin with
car
at the time.
except for the motor. Although I imagine there were maybe some suspension changes, a few other things. But, okay. That's what don't put baked beans in the...
That baked bean additive.
I mean, this car is almost 60 years old.
Yeah. It's astonishing to even conceive. And you know, you often make the point that the ultimate development of a car can be so incredibly satisfying because the engineers finally figured out all the little tweaks they wanted to give the car, and they don't have to worry about paying for the tooling because it's all been amortized, so they can just have a bit of fun.
Yeah. And I see American cars doing that too. I mean, the Dodge Charger has had the same body style since 2008. But if you drive it early, when you drive a later one, much tighter, much firmer, better handling. I mean, they've done all the important improvements because it's still a good-looking car.
So we've had a Carrera Cabriolet, the Carrera 2, and now the Carrera GT.
Yeah, it's so fun to live long enough to be excited when this got introduced. And then it kind of fell out of favor. Critics didn't like this, somebody didn't like that, you know, the value went down. And then suddenly people realized we were all wrong, and now the price has skyrocketed. These are over $2 million now.
And the price have skyrocketed. Why? Because of the dynamic personality of this car. Let's check it out.
This car has a reputation, I don't know if it's deserved, of being the last true analog Porsche.
I think so.
And I think it is true because this predates the manual gearbox and all of that. It's a wonderful car to drive. V10 engine, 5.7 liter. What is it, 617 horsepower? The most powerful Porsche produced up to this period. This is an engine left over from racing. They developed it. I'm not sure what part of racing they developed it for, but it kind of sat on the shelf and they thought, well, let's do something with it. And they put it in this thing. And it is the best sounding Porsche ever. It is just
an amazing
fabulous car to drive. And the reason I love it is the reason a lot of people did not like it. It was the clutch. It has a revolutionary 6-inch clutch. Very, very tiny clutch, but very powerful. And people would say, oh, it's stalled all the time. No, the way you drive this car is, once you start it, you release the clutch with absolutely no throttle, and then at the same time, either floor the throttle or whatever you're trying to do, you're trying to get it quick, and then just apply a little bit of throttle, and you pull away fine.
Well, isn't that another aspect of analog cars, the fact that they require you to adapt to the way they operate?
Right, you have to master the car, which it's like the pre-war Bentley gearbox. Once you master it, you feel like a genius because everybody else is crunching gears and everything. You're like, oh, how do you do that? And then they ask you how you do it and all that. But this car, they were supposed to build 1,500. I think they built 1,230 or 1,203. I'm dyslexic, I'm not sure which that is.
Yeah.
But they only built approximately 1,200 cars because it was expensive, $450,000. It seems like a bargain today. But you realize this car is now 20 years old. And I love mine. I mean, I think it's just the greatest car to drive. With the roof on, it's quite claustrophobic. With the roof off, oh, it's the greatest car.
And Jay, we've been talking about the Carreras. This is the third Carrera named car we've driven today.
Right.
And I think that certainly I'm hearing in your statements about your Carrera GT and this Carrera GT, certainly a car that is deserving of the name.
Oh, it is. It's a bit, you know, it's a car, it's so low to the ground. I bought a factory lift kit which raised it 1/4 of an inch. So instead of going on bumps, it goes it's just a little higher pitch. You still scrape, but it's really a car. It's the car I drove at Talladega. We tried to do 100 laps at 190 miles an hour. We broke a few records with it. Well, they were those kind of phony records, they give celebrities to break. It's not like. But
yeah, I had no idea that there was an entire classification of phony celebrity.
But driving this car around Talladega at 190 miles an hour was a real experience, especially for like 100 laps, because after a while, as the tires began to wear, you felt it move around in the corners at 180, 190, and just the slightest input. And after we had finished, they gave me the thumbs up. That's good. I said, "Oh, great." I gave them the thumbs back. I lifted the throttle, and the rear end came around, boom, 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 and it just, I use that old thing. You'll always hit what you're looking at. So anytime I saw the wall, I would just keep cutting the wheel to avoid hitting the wall. So I managed to keep it spinning down the center of the track. Flat spotted all 4 tires, but didn't wreck the car. Didn't wreck the car and didn't get hurt. And
now this was your car you were driving.
Not mine, one of Porsche's.
One of Porsche's. Okay, even better, because you hate to wreck somebody else's car.
Right.
But
Well, I'd much rather wreck somebody else's car.
Well, to your point about setting celebrity records, was that the celebrity record for the number of 360s on one straightaway?
It might be. But it was fun to do. I had Mark Donahue. You saw the difference between me and a professional race car driver that day.
Not Mark Donahue.
I mean David Donahue,
yeah.
Sorry. I mean David Donahue's son, yeah. But on the open road, there's nothing that beats the sound of this normally aspirated V10 engine, or naturally aspirated, I guess you'd say.
Well, it's the thing, you talked about the gestation of this engine. During this period of time, also, the V10 was the standard power plant for Formula One.
Right.
And there were all sorts of rumors that Porsche was going to come back into Formula One, and that was perhaps the origin of this engine, although I think that's been debunked because it's not a Formula One type engine.
Right.
It's a lot heavier than you put in a Formula One car. But people were really thinking about V10s were sort of the ultimate performance engine at that point.
Right.
And I remember also being in Monterey when they unveiled the concept of the Carrera GT, and I also think they did a really great job of bringing this car to the road very close to the concept.
Right. It's interesting. They were 450,000 new. At the lowest point, maybe 5, 6, 7, they went to $200,000.
If you could find one.
If you could find one. But I knew when I drove the 918, I said, this is a nice car, but I like my Carrera better. I feel more bonded. And after that, the prices, and now they're in the $2 million range, 2.2, 2.3. I bet Porsche wish they had built that last 300,
Well, it's also quite interesting that Porsche does something that a lot of manufacturers don't really think of following through on, which is the fact that they built this car for a very short period of time and built very few of them. But they do keep track of where these cars are and try to make sure that they're maintained and serviced so that they can be used in some sort of a way that befits their performance capability.
Right.
Which is to the other point, you talk about the sort of track day street cars.
You're going fast when you get Donald to stop talking.
Just for a second.
Just for a moment. That's just a momentary breath. Okay, here we're back. Oh. And it is low.
Yes. It's the fact that this car feels like it's on a track on the street. You don't get that sort of duality at all.
That's why I think the Japanese, when they build a supercar, they make the mistake of going, the NSX is a race car, but on the road, it drives and feels like a Honda. Well, I got a Honda already.
Right,
I want something, I'm driving it for the experience, This always feels like you're, if not racing, at least pseudo-racing.
You're driving purposefully in this car. This is not the car you sort of cruise around town in. We've had some of these conversations before, like some of the mid-late 50s fuel-injected Corvettes or Ferrari Daytona. It's a car you have to be on in order to really engage with. It's not a car that you sort of lift and cruise.
And if this car was being built today, it would have the hydraulic lift system and everything else, but it doesn't, so you have to be very careful. You scrape with it. Pulling into a gas station, you got to crab in. I mean, listen to that motor. Just probably one of the best sounding engines. Certainly rivals for sound, I think, the McLaren F1.
And it's funny too, because Porsche devotees certainly love the very unique sound that Porsche makes, but I think this is an engine that appeals to sort of a wider range of engine musicians.
Right.
Do you agree? And, we've had conversations about electric cars.
Right.
And what they bring to the table in terms of performance and driving experience. And again, I just keep coming back to the fact that as a musician, I want that sound. I need that sound.
Yeah.
I also love the click of that gearbox,
Yeah, yes. Wonderful gearbox. It reminds me of the Alfa Romeo of the 60s when it had it high up on the stalk. That's what I love about it.
And you knew that at the end of that ball went directly into the transmission. No linkages.
Right.
It was just that, it's an amazing feeling.
Yeah, I believe this is a car that will continue to go up in value because A, totally different engine design, a V10, again, no turbochargers, no superchargers. It's the last link to the old school kind of driving.
As we talked about in the 1987 911 Carrera Cabriolet, the last of the original 911 model.
Right.
It's that whole idea of the technology, and the 1964 356 Carrera 2. It's the last of that mechanical idea taken to its ultimate expression.
And make no mistake, this is a car that can break away from you. You put your foot in it in second gear or third gear, and she can go sideways on you if you don't have good tires. I mean, I think that was the saddest thing about the Paul Walker incident was the fact that the car had 8 to 10-year-old tires on it, and plus you're on those Boss dots, which is these are reflectors they put in the roads in California that I guess are plastic. So when you hit them with a tire, you're just it's almost like ice. So the combination of a lot of power, no traction control.
Which is a very interesting point about high performance cars as they become collectible items. And people talk about this all the time with Bugattis, etc. But especially with a car like this Carrera GT, you have to maintain it in a manner commensurate with the performance.
Right.
You can't slack off. You can't say, well, I'll get the bargain tires because they have a special at the local tire store. I'll just throw those on.
Right.
You'll get into trouble very quickly.
Yeah, and maintenance can be eye-watering on these things. It's just unbelievable. But it hasn't been too bad for me. All I've done is replace tires. It's interesting. I had this car. After about 10 years, I noticed it was, I would hit bumps on the freeway and slam down. But I realized my shocks were wearing out at the rate of about 3 or 4% a year. So it never was evident to me.
Right.
And I thought, what's wrong with this thing? And one day I was on the road and I hit a bump and literally almost changed lanes with it. I went, geez, what was that? Why is this doing it? Well, I went and my shocks were completely worn out. Besides being old, I've had this car since 2004, mine. And this is like in 2014 or 15. I put new shocks on it. Oh my God. I had a brand new car again, and I realized, all right, I'm not going to defer maintenance again.
It's a really important point that you make with any old car, especially a high performance car, is to stay ahead of the maintenance because, as you mentioned, you drive it occasionally, you don't notice the small deterioration. And when you think about the complete package that these cars are designed to be, the tires and the suspension and all of those parts working together to deliver the kind of performance the way it has to be delivered.
Yeah, and this car started a trend which I think, well, it certainly got on the bandwagon, a trend that started the F1 McLaren of specific mechanics who do nothing but this car.
Right.
I have a friend named Pani. He works for McLaren. There are 64 McLaren F1s. He travels the world, Tokyo, France, Portugal, everywhere, to work on the cars. And same thing with Porsche. There are Porsche Carrera GT specialists. Same way you go to a specialist for, you know, some medical thing, you've got Porsche specialists as well. And they know these cars.
So Jay, I think you've certainly seen how the ultimate derivation of a model can also compare and combine with great style. The house we've seen today, Ocean Lawn, the home of Betsy Firestone and her incredible wardrobe, my wonderful wardrobe, your great driving style, a match made in heaven.
I'm sorry, I wasn't listening. I was driving this Porsche. So whatever Donald said, I agree with 100%. Let's get back to driving this thing, and we'll see you guys in the next episode. This is the great. I'm going home and driving mine as soon as I park this.